Some places are sold for pennies because the world believes they are empty, but sometimes the land remembers what men forgot. The old auction hall in Sheridan, Wyoming, smelled of dust, cracked leather, and rain that hadn't touched the valley in months. Sunlight slipped through warped wooden slats high above the rafters, cutting thin golden lines across rows of tired ranchers, bankers in polished boots, and land speculators who had come not for hope, but for bargains. Caleb Harper stood near the back wall, his weathered Stetson pulled low, shoulders heavy beneath a faded denim jacket worn thin by years of hard winters and harder losses. At 42, Caleb looked like the kind of man the prairie tried to break but never quite finished. His cattle were gone. His savings had dried up with the creek behind his old property. And after burying both his wife and the dream they built together beneath Montana soil, all he had left was silence and a stubborn refusal to disappear. Lot 12, the auctioneer called, his voice crackling through an ancient speaker. Black Hollow Ranch. Condemned property. 120 acres. Structures unsafe. Water rights unclear. Opening bid, $1. Laughter rolled through the room like distant thunder. Men shook their heads. One rancher muttered loud enough for others to hear, "That cursed patch ain't worth the dust on my boots." Another smirked, "Buy that place and you'll inherit ghosts, not land." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had heard the rumors. Black Hollow had sat abandoned for nearly 30 years, tucked deep in a forgotten stretch of Wyoming where winter wind screamed through empty barns and fences rotted into the earth. Some said the original owners vanished. Others claimed the land itself was worthless. But Caleb knew something most men in that room had forgotten. Broken things were often abandoned long before their true value was understood. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow. "Do I hear $1? Silence settled heavy. Caleb's rough hand rose slowly into the stale air. $1, he said. For a moment, even the dust seemed to stop moving. Then came the laughter. Louder this time. Sharper. Boots scraped wood. Floors. A banker near the front nearly choked on his coffee. Harper's finally lost his damn mind. But Caleb didn't flinch. His grey eyes stayed fixed ahead, steady as stone. Sold. The gavel struck once, echoing like a gunshot through the hollow room. Just like that, for less than the price of a cup of coffee, Caleb Harper became the owner of Black Hollow Ranch. Outside, the Wyoming wind cut across the parking lot with a bitter edge, tugging at his coat as he folded the deed into his pocket. The paper felt impossibly small for something that could either ruin him completely or save him. As his rusted Ford pickup rattled west toward the forgotten property, storm clouds gathered low over the distant hills. Miles later, Caleb reached the ranch gate just before sundown. The iron arch hung crooked, nearly swallowed by weeds. The barn stood in silhouette against a blood-orange sky, leaning but unbroken. And there, standing motionless in the shadows behind the shattered corral fence, was a horse. Tall. White-gray. Wild-eyed. Watching him as though it had been waiting for his return. The truck engine fell silent beneath a sky turning the color of cold iron, and for several long seconds, Caleb Harper simply sat behind the wheel, his calloused hands resting motionless as the Wyoming wind whispered across the hood. Black Hollow Ranch stretched before him like a forgotten scar upon the earth. The main house sagged beneath decades of neglect, its once white paint weathered to gray splinters, windows dark and hollow as though the place itself had closed its eyes to the world. Fence posts leaned at broken angles. The windmill near the dried well groaned softly with each gust, its rusted blades turning like the slow passage of old regrets. But Caleb's eyes were not on the house. They remained fixed on the horse. The animal stood just beyond the collapsed corral, half veiled by drifting dust and twilight. Its silver-gray coat caught the fading light like smoke moving through shadows. Tall and lean, with an untamed mane shifting in the wind, the mustang carried itself with an eerie stillness that did not feel wild so much as deliberate. Its dark eyes watched Caleb with the unsettling calm of something that recognized him long before they had ever met. Most horses would have fled. This one did not move. Caleb stepped from the truck, his boots crunching against dry gravel, every instinct sharpened by years spent reading livestock and weather alike. "Easy now," he said quietly, his voice roughened by loss and prairie wind. The horse flicked one ear forward. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared behind the barn. Caleb followed, though he could not have explained why. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was the stubborn thread of hope that had not yet died inside him. Or perhaps it was something older, something the land itself seemed to breathe into him. Behind the barn, he found not emptiness, but signs of life. Fresh hoofprints marked the dirt. Water troughs, though old, had somehow been recently disturbed. A narrow side door hung partially open, creaking against the wind. Caleb frowned. This place had been abandoned for 30 years. Yet something had survived here. He stepped inside the barn, where fading sunlight spilled through holes in the roof, casting pale beams across floating dust. The smell was old hay, cedar rot, and something else beneath it all, something warm and alive. In the far stall, the mustang stood waiting. Caleb's breath caught. The stall was cleaner than the rest of the structure. Straw had been gathered. Rainwater had collected in rusted buckets positioned carefully beneath roof leaks. And etched deeply into the wooden wall beside the horse was a symbol Caleb recognized instantly, though he had not seen it since childhood, the Harper family brand. His heart gave a slow, heavy thud. The same mark once burned proudly onto his grandfather's cattle before drought, debt, and death had scattered the family legacy across state lines. Caleb stepped closer, brushing trembling fingers over the faded emblem. "That cannot be," he whispered. The horse lowered its head slightly, not in fear but in quiet acknowledgement. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over distant hills. Caleb stood in the gathering dark, surrounded by dust, memory, and silence, as the impossible truth began to settle like rain on parched ground. He had not just purchased abandoned land. Somehow, against all reason, he had come home. Night settled slowly over Black Hollow, stretching long blue shadows across broken fences and forgotten fields, while the first cold drops of rain tapped softly against the barn roof like cautious fingers waking old memories. Caleb lit a rusted oil lantern he had found hanging near the entrance, its amber glow flickering against weathered beams blackened by time. Every board creaked with history. Every corner seemed to breathe with silence too deep to be empty. Yet through it all, the mustang remained calm. The horse stood in the far stall, powerful and ghost-like in the dim light, its pale coat shimmering beneath drifting dust as though shaped from moonlight and storm clouds. Caleb moved carefully, his instinct steady despite the strange tightening in his chest. He had spent his life around horses, but there was something profoundly different about this one. Not merely strength. Not merely survival. It was presence. The kind that made a man feel he was standing near something sacred. "You have been here all this time, have you not?" Caleb murmured. The horse's dark eyes held his, intelligent and unwavering. Then it gave a slow nod of its head toward the rear wall of the stall. Caleb frowned. At first, he saw nothing but old timber and hanging cobwebs. But as the lantern light shifted, his gaze caught something unnatural beneath years of dirt and decay, a narrow iron ring half buried in the floorboards. Kneeling down, his knees groaning against rough wood, Caleb brushed away dust with trembling fingers. Beneath it lay a concealed trapdoor. His breath hitched. Rain intensified overhead, drumming harder now, while thunder rolled over the distant plains. For a long moment, Caleb simply stared, his heart pounding with the strange certainty that this land had been waiting for him to uncover its buried truths. He gripped the iron ring and pulled. The wood resisted at first, swollen by decades of neglect. Then, with a heavy groan, the hatch gave way. A cool breath of earth rose from below, carrying the scent of cedar, stone, and something astonishingly preserved. Lantern. Raised, Caleb peered into the darkness to reveal a narrow staircase descending beneath the barn. "Lord above," he whispered. The mustang stepped forward but did not descend. Instead, it stood watch at the entrance, ears alert, like a guardian fulfilling an ancient duty. Caleb swallowed hard and began his descent. Below, hidden beneath Black Hollow for generations, he discovered a chamber untouched by time. Shelves lined with ledgers, oilcloth maps, weathered legal documents, family photographs sealed in metal tins. And there, mounted carefully on the far stone wall, was an old wooden plaque bearing the Harper family crest alongside a faded message carved by hand: "What was lost shall one day return through blood, land, and trust." Caleb's hands shook as he opened one brittle ledger. Inside were property deeds proving that Black Hollow had once been the crown jewel of his grandfather's holdings before corruption and deception stripped it away. More shocking still were detailed survey maps revealing a massive underground freshwater aquifer running directly beneath the ranch, one of the largest natural water reserves in the region. On land where drought had ruined countless families, water was worth more than cattle, more than oil, more than gold. Caleb sank slowly to one knee, overwhelmed not by wealth, but by the impossible weight of destiny unfolding before him. Above, the storm raged across Wyoming. But deep beneath the barn, surrounded by the buried legacy of his bloodline, Caleb Harper finally understood. The horse had not simply survived here. It had been protecting something priceless. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving Black Hollow washed in silver light and silence so profound it felt almost holy. Rain clung to the broken fence rails in trembling beads. Sagebrush glistened beneath the rising Wyoming sun. And for the first time in decades, the dry creek bed running through the property whispered with the faint sound of moving water. Caleb stood on the barn threshold, hat in hand, staring across the sprawling acres that had once been dismissed as cursed wasteland. But now he knew better. Beneath his boots lay life itself. The hidden aquifer his grandfather had protected in secret was real, and if the documents in the underground chamber held legal weight, Black Hollow was more than abandoned land. It was one of the most valuable ranch properties in the region. Yet Caleb's thoughts were not on fortune. They were on the horse. The silver-gray mustang stood atop a nearby ridge, mane stirring in the cool morning wind, framed by amber sunlight like something carved from the spirit of the frontier itself. "Ghost," Caleb said softly, the name coming to him as naturally as breath. The horse turned at once, ears lifting. It was not ownership Caleb felt. It was partnership. Respect. As though the land had entrusted its final guardian to him only after measuring his worth. Throughout the day, Caleb worked with a renewed strength he had not felt in years. He cleared debris from the old well house. He studied the ledgers. He inspected the irrigation maps left behind by his ancestors. Every discovery deepened the truth: Black Hollow had not failed naturally. It had been deliberately manipulated into collapse decades earlier through forged tax liens and corporate land theft orchestrated by powerful interests seeking control of the hidden water reserve. Caleb's jaw hardened as pieces began to align. His family had not simply lost this ranch. It had been stolen. By late afternoon, an unwelcome visitor arrived in a gleaming black SUV that looked painfully out of place against the dust and weathered timber. Richard Mercer, CEO of High Plains Energy, stepped out in polished boots and a tailored coat, his practiced smile never reaching his cold eyes. "Mr. Harper," he called smoothly. "I see you survived your first night." Caleb remained still beside the corral, one hand resting lightly on Ghost's neck. "Seems I did." Mercer glanced across the land with unmistakable calculation. "Truth is, I came to offer you a favor. Black Hollow has complications. Environmental liabilities. Legal burdens. I am prepared to buy it from you today for $20,000. Cash." $20,000 was more money than Caleb had seen in years. Enough to tempt a desperate man. Enough to erase debt. But Caleb was no longer desperate. He had seen what lay beneath this soil. More importantly, Ghost's muscles tensed beneath his hand, the horse's ears pinning sharply toward Mercer with instinctive distrust. Caleb looked the businessman dead in the eye. "Not for sale." For the first time, Mercer's smile faltered. "You may want to reconsider," he said carefully. "Some land carries burdens heavier than profit." Caleb's voice remained calm, though steel had entered it. "Funny thing about burdens. I have carried enough to know when something is worth keeping." Mercer studied him for one long moment before turning back toward his vehicle. "This is not over, Harper." Dust swirled behind the departing SUV as silence reclaimed the ranch. Ghost exhaled deeply beside him, steady and certain. Caleb watched the horizon darken with gathering clouds, but this time, he did not feel fear. He felt purpose. Because for the first time in his broken life, Caleb Harper was no longer running from ruin. He was standing exactly where fate had intended all along. The days that followed carried the sharp rhythm of rebirth. Under vast Wyoming skies, Caleb rose before sunrise each morning, his breath curling in the cold as he worked land most men had dismissed as dead. He repaired splintered fence lines with weathered hands. Cleared decades of brush from dried irrigation trenches. Studied every map and journal hidden beneath the barn until the faded ink of his grandfather's words felt as familiar as scripture. And always, Ghost remained near. The Mustang moved like wind across the property, never confined, yet never far. He seemed to know every forgotten trail, every weakened structure, every buried corner of Black Hollow better than any living man. More than once, Caleb found himself abandoning logic simply to follow the horse's instincts. Each time, it led him somewhere vital. A hidden cistern. Rusted irrigation valves. Boundary markers long obscured by overgrowth. It was as though Ghost was not merely surviving on the land, but restoring it. One crisp morning, with autumn gold beginning to creep across the prairie grass, Ghost refused to enter the north pasture. Instead, the horse paced near a distant ridge overlooking the driest stretch of the ranch, snorting softly, his silver mane whipping against the wind. Caleb frowned and followed on foot. The ridge rose above a barren basin cracked by years of drought, a place surveyors had deemed worthless decades ago. Yet Ghost pawed at the earth with unusual urgency, then stood still, staring directly at Caleb. "You are trying to show me something again, are you not?" Caleb murmured. Taking up an old shovel from his truck, he began digging where the horse had marked. The soil was dry for the first few feet. Then suddenly, dark moisture appeared. Caleb's pulse quickened. He dug deeper. And within minutes, water surged upward from beneath the earth, cold and clear as crystal, spilling over his boots in a miraculous rush. Caleb stumbled back in stunned silence. The underground aquifer was even stronger than the old maps had suggested. This basin was not barren. It was the key to transforming Black Hollow into one of the richest grazing properties in the state. He laughed then, a sound rusty from years of grief, carried away by the Wyoming wind like something sacred returning home. But hope, Caleb was learning, always attracted opposition. By week's end, heavy machinery appeared at the ranch perimeter. Survey crews from High Plains Energy began placing unauthorized stakes near Black Hollow's eastern boundary. Mercer was moving faster now, using legal pressure and intimidation to force Caleb into surrendering before he could fully establish his claim. Notices arrived. Tax disputes resurfaced. Questions about deed legitimacy suddenly emerged from long-buried county records. Caleb sat one evening on the porch steps, exhaustion weighing heavily across his shoulders as legal papers fluttered in his lap. "They are trying to bury us again," he said quietly. Ghost stood nearby beneath the fading sunset, his silhouette powerful against fields beginning to green from newly uncovered water. The horse stepped closer, lowering his head until his warm breath touched Caleb's shoulder. It was a simple gesture. Yet in that moment, Caleb felt something stronger than fear. Not wealth. Not revenge. Resolve. He folded the papers carefully, rose to his feet, and looked out across the land his bloodline had once lost. "Not this time," he said. The words were not spoken in anger. They were spoken with certainty. Because Black Hollow was no longer abandoned. Its guardian had endured. Its truth had survived. And now, so would the man chosen to reclaim it. Winter came early to Wyoming that year, sweeping across Black Hollow in silver frost and hard northern winds that bent grass low and tested every board, beam, and soul upon the ranch. Yet where ruin once stood, resilience now answered. Water from the rediscovered basin had begun to breathe life back into long-starved soil. Fresh grazing patches spread across the lower pastures. Neighboring ranchers, once mocking Caleb's purchase, now watched from a distance with narrowed eyes and quiet disbelief as the cursed land slowly transformed into promise. But prosperity had made Black Hollow visible, and visibility invited greed. The legal battle arrived in earnest just after the first heavy snow. Mercer's corporation filed aggressive claims alleging improper auction procedures, disputed mineral rights, and falsified inheritance records. Caleb received the thick envelope at sunrise, its crisp white paper stark against weathered porch boards. By the time he finished reading, his jaw had set like granite. Court hearings were scheduled. Surveyors returned. County officials suddenly questioned records that had sat untouched for generations. It was clear Mercer was not seeking justice. He was buying time, pressure, and influence. Caleb spent long nights beneath lantern light in the underground chamber, combing through his family's preserved ledgers for proof strong enough to withstand corporate power. Sleep became scarce. Doubt, though unwelcome, crept in like cold through cracked walls. One particularly bitter evening, after hours of fruitless searching, Caleb slammed shut another useless tax ledger and exhaled heavily. There has to be something they missed, he muttered into the dim silence. Above him, Ghost's distant whinny broke through the storm. Caleb climbed the stairs and stepped into swirling snow. The Mustang stood beyond the barn, already moving toward the far western ridge, where moonlight silvered untouched drifts. Despite exhaustion, Caleb followed. Through freezing wind and knee-deep snow, Ghost led him farther than he had yet explored, to an overgrown section of the property where ancient cottonwoods twisted against the winter sky. There, half buried beneath ice and brush, stood the ruins of a long-forgotten line shack. Its roof had partially collapsed, but the stone chimney remained. Ghost pawed once at the snow near the entrance. Caleb cleared debris with numb hands until he uncovered a sealed metal lockbox hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside lay what decades of corruption had failed to erase: original land patents, notarized water rights, and personal letters from Caleb's grandfather detailing the fraudulent coercion used to steal Black Hollow. More importantly, the documents bore official county seals and judicial signatures that predated every manipulated claim Mercer now relied upon. Caleb stared at the papers, snow melting on his coat, emotion tightening his throat. "You knew," he whispered to Ghost. "All this time, you knew." The horse stood silent beneath moonlight, powerful and still, his breath rising like mist from another world. In that moment, Caleb understood something beyond logic. Ghost had not simply guarded land. He had guarded truth. Days later, the courtroom in Sheridan fell silent as Caleb presented the recovered evidence. Mercer's attorneys, polished and confident only hours before, faltered visibly beneath irrefutable proof. County officials reversed prior challenges. Corporate claims collapsed. Black Hollow's ownership, water rights, and mineral protections were fully restored under Caleb Harper's name. Mercer left the courthouse without a word, his empire denied the one acquisition he could not manipulate. Outside, snow drifted softly across Main Street as Caleb stepped into the pale winter sun, legal burdens finally lifted. For the first time in many years, the weight he carried did not feel like survival. It felt like legacy. And waiting by the hitching post, beneath a sky wide enough to hold redemption itself, stood Ghost. Spring arrived over Black Hollow not as a season, but as a resurrection. Snowmelt fed the hidden aquifer, and for the first time in living memory, green spread across the ranch like a promise fulfilled. Grass rose thick through once barren pasture. Cottonwoods budded along the creek bed. Wildflowers pushed through the same earth that men had called worthless. Under Caleb Harper's steady hand, the forgotten property transformed into one of the most thriving ranches in Sheridan County. New fencing lined the boundaries. Fresh cattle grazed the lower fields. Water flowed clean through restored irrigation channels his grandfather had designed generations before. Word traveled quickly across Wyoming. Some called it luck. Others whispered miracle. But those who truly knew the land understood something deeper had taken place. Black Hollow had not been rebuilt by money alone. It had been reclaimed by truth, endurance, and a horse no one could explain. Caleb never tried to tame Ghost in the traditional sense. There were no bridles forced, no ropes tightened, no spirit broken. The Mustang remained free, moving across the ranch with sovereign grace, appearing where needed most. Ranch hands swore Ghost would alert them to broken gates before cattle escaped. Storms never seemed to catch Caleb unprepared when the horse grew restless. More than once, Ghost led workers away from unstable ground or flooded trenches moments before disaster struck. To many, the silver-gray stallion became more legend than animal, a living thread between the Harper family's fractured past and its restored future. Yet prosperity also brought attention. Newspaper articles began to circulate. Agricultural investors sought partnerships. Conservation groups expressed interest in the rare water reserve beneath Black Hollow. Caleb handled each offer with quiet caution, refusing to allow greed to poison what sacrifice had restored. "This land is not for exploiting," he told one wealthy developer from Denver. "It is for stewarding." But Caleb's greatest transformation was not measured in acreage or profit. It was measured in healing. The grief he had carried since losing his wife no longer hollowed him with the same relentless ache. Black Hollow, in all its scars and survival, had given him purpose greater than mourning. On warm evenings, he often sat upon the porch as sunset poured gold across the valley, watching Ghost move like silver fire through swaying grass. In those quiet moments, Caleb no longer felt abandoned by fate. He felt chosen by it. One late afternoon, while repairing fence near the western ridge, Caleb discovered something unexpected beneath a cluster of old cedar trees, a small family cemetery long hidden by neglect. Modest stone markers bore the names of his ancestors, including his grandfather, Thomas Harper, whose final resting place had been erased from official records when the ranch was stolen. Caleb removed his hat and stood in silence as wind moved softly through the grass. On Thomas Harper's weathered headstone were carved words nearly lost to time: "Protect the water. Trust the horse. Keep the land." Caleb's throat tightened as Ghost appeared silently beside him, lowering his noble head. There, among generations who had fought to preserve what others sought to claim, Caleb understood fully. His journey had never been about buying a cheap ranch. It had been about restoring a covenant. The land. The bloodline. The truth. And standing beneath the endless Wyoming sky, beside the horse who had guarded destiny itself, Caleb Harper finally knew he was no longer merely surviving history. He was honoring it. By the second summer, Black Hollow had become something few believed possible, not merely a restored ranch, but a symbol. Families struggling beneath drought and debt began visiting Caleb's property, seeking advice on water conservation, land stewardship, and rebuilding what hard times had stripped away. Ranchers who once laughed at his $1 gamble now tipped their hats with quiet respect. School children came on field trips to witness the legendary silver-gray Mustang that roamed the hills like a spirit of the old frontier. Even state agricultural officials recognized Black Hollow as one of Wyoming's most remarkable recoveries, citing its underground aquifer system as a model for sustainable ranching in the modern West. Yet Caleb remained unchanged in the ways that mattered most. He still rose before dawn. Still repaired fences with his own hands. Still paused each morning by the family graves beneath the cedar trees, honoring those whose sacrifices had made this redemption possible. Wealth had come, yes, but not in the form Mercer once coveted. Caleb's fortune was measured in restored purpose, fertile soil, and the quiet dignity of preserving something sacred. Ghost, too, had become part of Black Hollow's living heartbeat. Though age subtly touched the stallion's powerful frame, his spirit never dimmed. He remained watchful, wise, and fiercely free. Caleb never questioned where Ghost went during his solitary rides across the outer ridges, nor how he always seemed to appear exactly when needed. Some bonds were not meant to be explained. They were meant to be honored. One blistering August afternoon, disaster nearly returned. Lightning from a dry storm ignited brush fires across neighboring properties, and fierce winds drove flames dangerously close to Black Hollow's western pasture. Ranchers scrambled. Sirens wailed across the valley. Caleb and his crew worked tirelessly to move cattle and reinforce fire breaks, but shifting winds threatened to trap dozens of livestock near a remote canyon bend. Smoke darkened the sky. Ash fell like gray snow. Then Ghost vanished. Panic stirred in Caleb's chest, but before fear could root itself, a ranch hand shouted from the ridge. There, through smoke and flame, Ghost appeared leading the trapped herd with astonishing precision, guiding them through an old canyon route hidden behind stone outcroppings known only to the land itself. His silver body moved like living light against smoke-darkened hills, calm where chaos ruled. One by one, the cattle followed. By sunset, every animal had been safely brought home. Black Hollow stood scarred at its borders, but alive. That night, exhausted ranchers gathered beneath stars veiled in lingering smoke, and for the first time, even the hardest men among them spoke openly of Ghost not as an animal, but as something providential. Caleb found the stallion later atop the western ridge, overlooking the valley as moonlight silvered his mane. "You saved us again," Caleb said softly. "Ghost" turned his noble head, eyes reflecting starlight older than memory. Caleb smiled, though emotion thickened his voice. "Or maybe, this was always your land, and I was simply the man fortunate enough to help protect it." The Mustang exhaled warmly into the night air. Below them, Black Hollow glowed with lantern light, thriving fields, and the steady pulse of life reborn from ash, loss, and forgotten truth. And standing there, beneath an endless sky where wind carried both memory and mercy, Caleb Harper understood that destiny had never truly been about ownership. It had always been about guardianship. Years passed across Black Hollow the way seasons were meant to pass across sacred land, not as burdens to endure, but as chapters of stewardship, memory, and renewal. The ranch flourished beyond anything Caleb Harper could have imagined on that dusty day he had raised one trembling hand in an auction hall full of mockery. Pastures rolled green beneath endless Wyoming skies. Herds multiplied. Water remained abundant, carefully protected beneath policies Caleb himself helped shape for neighboring ranchers throughout the region. What had once been dismissed as cursed wasteland had become one of the most respected working ranches in the American West, known not only for its prosperity, but for its integrity. Caleb's name came to mean something rare in modern times, a man who had inherited ruin, discovered truth, and chosen responsibility over greed. Yet even as Black Hollow grew, Caleb never allowed its story to become merely his own. He established conservation easements to protect the land from future exploitation. He restored the old family cemetery and rebuilt the original homestead as a historical trust, preserving his ancestors' sacrifices for generations yet unborn. Children from struggling ranch families were welcomed each summer to learn horsemanship, resilience, and stewardship beneath Black Hollow's wide horizon. And always, at the heart of it all, was Ghost. The silver-gray Mustang grew older with the quiet majesty of legend. His muzzle silvered further. His movements, though still powerful, carried the measured grace of time. But his spirit never weakened. He remained untethered, roaming ridges, valleys, and cedar groves with sovereign freedom, as though he belonged not to any man, but to the land itself. Caleb understood this better than anyone. Their bond had never required ownership. It had been forged through trust, purpose, and something deeper than words. One autumn evening, beneath a sky drenched in crimson and gold, Caleb rode alone to the western ridge where Ghost had first revealed Black Hollow's hidden truths. Wind moved gently through tall grass, carrying the scent of cedar and distant rain. Ghost stood waiting there, as he had so many times before, silhouetted against the setting sun. Caleb dismounted slowly, his joints older now, his face lined by weather and wisdom rather than grief. He rested one hand against Ghost's neck, feeling the familiar warmth beneath silver hair. "You gave me back more than land," Caleb said softly. "You gave me back myself." Ghost lowered his head, breathing calmly into the quiet. For a long while, man and horse stood together above the valley they had restored. Below them stretched thriving fields, healthy herds, and homes lit warmly against the approaching dusk. Black Hollow was no longer a place of abandonment. It was living proof that what had been broken could be redeemed when guarded by courage, truth, and mercy. As stars slowly awakened overhead, Ghost stepped back, his dark eyes steady and knowing. Then, With the same wild grace that had first appeared from shadow all those years ago, he turned and galloped toward the high ridges, silver mane blazing beneath the last light of day, until he vanished into the vastness of the frontier. Caleb did not call after him. Some miracles were never meant to be possessed, only honored. And standing alone beneath heaven's widening sky, Caleb Harper smiled through quiet tears, knowing Black Hollow would endure, not because one man had saved it, but because one faithful horse had reminded him that destiny often waits where others see only ruin. Sometimes, the weakest land carries the strongest miracle. And sometimes, the horse everyone thought was lost is the one that leads a broken man home.